The woman known to history as Pocahontas was born around 1596 and given the name Matoax or Matoaka. Pocahontas was a nickname meaning playful one, which she was given during her childhood. Pocahontas's father was a man named Wahunseneka, the paramount chief of the Powhatan nation, whose homeland was called Senacomaca in the Powhatan language. He was later known to the English as Chief Powhatan. Wahunseneka initially controlled 6 tribes, but by the early 17th century he used a combination of military and diplomatic means to establish an alliance network known as the Powhatan Confederacy that included over 30 tribes in an area of around 100 square miles, encompassing Tidewater, Virginia, and the southern part of the eastern shore. According to Powhatan tradition, Chief Wahunseneka married several women from each tribe within the Confederacy in order to strengthen blood ties with his allies. Each of the tribes chose a woman to be married to the paramount chief. As a political marriage, it was a temporary pairing, and the woman was free to return to her tribe after giving birth to the chief's child, where she would be received with great honor. As a result of these arrangements, Wahunseneka had many children, of whom Pocahontas was just one, but some English sources suggested that she was her father's favorite child. Some scholars argue that the English could not have known this and made the claim because Pocahontas appeared to show favor for the English. The name of Pocahontas's mother is not mentioned in English sources, but according to the native history, she was a woman from the Mattaponi tribe, one of the 6 original tribes of the Powhatan nations, and she was also named Pocahontas. She was Wahunseneka's first wife and married him before he became chief. Therefore, he did not marry her for political reasons, but for love. She died after giving birth to her daughter, leaving Wahunseneka heartbroken. Buildeo, on the other hand, claims that Pocahontas's mother was a woman named Winganuske, one of Wahunseneka's 12 wives mentioned by the Englishman William Strachey in his 1612 account, The History of Travail into Virginia, Britannia. If this were the case, then Pocahontas's mother could not have died in childbirth. While Pocahontas is generally believed to have been born in the village of Werowocomoco, her father's capital, on the north bank of the York River, opposite the narrow Virginia Peninsula, the Mattaponi tradition claims that she was born at her mother's native village between the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi rivers, 2 of the main tributaries of the York River. This would explain her name Matoaka, which probably meant flower between 2 streams. Pocahontas's life is the tale of the interaction between 2 nations, her native Powhatan people and the English settlers who founded the Jamestown colony in Virginia. The English and the Powhatan narratives about Pocahontas' life can differ considerably in both the facts and the interpretation. While Pocahontas is mentioned in English sources in the early 17th century, in their 2007 book, The True Story of Pocahontas, The Other Side of History, Dr. Linwood Littlebear Costello and his anthropologist co-author Angela Daniel claim to have written down a Powhatan narrative that has been passed down generations over 4 centuries in an oral tradition among the Powhatan tribes. However, some Native American scholars, such as Helen Rountree, have cast doubt on whether such an oral tradition could have survived over 4 centuries. As oral histories can evolve over the centuries, these Native American narratives should also be examined critically. Conversely, the contemporary English accounts naturally gloss over atrocities committed by the Virginia colonists. While Costello's telling of Pocahontas's life story may be influenced by the hindsight of centuries of suffering inflicted on the native population by Europeans in North America. According to Costello, as Pocahontas grew up, the young child resembled Johann Seneca's late beloved wife and reminded him of her, and for this reason the chief would often call his daughter by her name of Pocahontas. Rather than taking her to Werowocomoco, Johann Seneca decided that his young daughter should be brought up by her Mattaponi aunts and cousins in her native village. Costello claims that Pocahontas was not the only child of her parents, and by the time of her birth, some of her elder siblings were already adults. Her elder sister, Matachana, was married to Uttamatamakin, a priest who belonged to the Uttamusak temple, the holiest site in the Powhatan lands, while her elder brothers ruled as chiefs of subordinate tribes. A few years after her birth, the young Pocahontas was taken to her father's court at Werowocomoco, where she was brought up by Matachana. From here, her father ruled over the Powhatan Confederacy of over 30 tribes, as Mamanatoic or Otaniac, terms which were used to refer to his position as paramount chief. Unlike in most historical European monarchies, where power transferred from the monarch to their sons or daughters, the Powhatan succession passed from brother to brother, and sometimes sisters. Although men usually ruled as chief, power also passed down the female line through the chief's sisters, an arrangement that English observers found peculiar. Although the English were to refer to Pocahontas as a princess, she did not stand to inherit her father's power. The 6 original tribes inherited by Johann Seneca had their own Werowonsis, or chiefs, though the allied tribes who were part of the wider confederation did not necessarily do so. Each of the 30 or so tribes had their own priests. The Powhatans worshipped the god Ahone, who created the world and all good things, while appeasing the evil spirit Ok with offerings. The priests also had an important role in Powhatan political life. While the chiefs initiated proposals in the council, the priests made the final decision. Despite her privileged status as the daughter of the chief, Pocahontas went about naked and barefoot during the summer and did not cut her hair until she came of age. As she grew older, she would have helped the women gather food, cook meals, and take care of her younger half-sisters, while her royal status meant that she was more closely supervised than other children. She lived up to her name by being a playful and joyous child who participated in the evening entertainments, and Johann Seneca's subjects recognized that she was her father's favorite child. While Scandinavian Vikings had known about and visited the American continent in the 11th century, it was not until Christopher Columbus's voyages in the 1490s that the so-called New World was opened up for large-scale exploration and exploitation by European colonial powers. Since the Italian Columbus was employed by the King and Queen of Spain, the Spanish were the first to begin the process of settlement and colonization, although another Italian navigator in the employ of King Henry VII of England, John Cabot, landed on the North American mainland in 1497. It was the English who would impact dramatically on the course of Pocahontas's life. There was soon conflict between these newcomers to the Americas and the natives. Not only did the Europeans enjoy superiority in lethal weaponry, but they unintentionally brought European diseases which wiped out large numbers of natives. Since the Spanish expeditions were motivated by the search for gold, their attention was drawn to Central and South America and the Caribbean islands, enslaving the surviving local population in silver and gold mines. It would be decades before the eastern seaboard of North America was impacted on in a sustained way by the Europeans. Other European nations were keen to challenge Spain's predominant position in the New World, particularly England, which, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I in the second half of the 16th century, began exploring the coast of North America further in the search of a northwest passage through to the Pacific Ocean, and also to lay down their own first colonies in the New World. The first English attempt to establish a colony in North America was led by Sir Walter Raleigh, who founded the Roanoke colony in 1585. Raleigh bestowed the name of Virginia upon the section of the coast of North America north of Spanish Florida and up to modern-day Maine, in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. The Powhatan would likely have known about the English colony in Roanoke, which collapsed within 5 years, with most inhabitants probably dying of starvation and disease, and any survivors enslaved by local tribes. In April 1606, King James I of England, during his 3rd year on the throne, established the Virginia Company to colonize Virginia to prevent the Spanish from establishing full control of the North American coast. In late 1606, a group of English colonists set sail under the terms of the Royal Charter and arrived in Virginia in late April 1607. After making land at Cape Henry, which they named after King James's son and heir, Prince Henry, they sailed into Powhatan territory up a river which they called the James River after the king himself. On the 14th of May, the colonists decided to build a fort on an uninhabited marshy island around 40 miles inland on the north bank of the river, which they called James's Fort, later Jamestown. Although the Powhatans hunted on the island, they did not set up any villages there, as there were many mosquitoes and it was difficult to find much food. As the Powhatans saw the English landing in Senecomica and discussed how to respond, Seneca and the priests hoped to establish friendly relations. Like the Spanish that the natives of North America knew so much about by then, the English had swords and guns. Seneca was keen to enlist them as potential allies and instructed his subjects to bring food to the settlers. The English believed that the food was tribute and that they would continue to receive it from the Powhatans. When this was not the case, English bands would turn up at Powhatan villages demanding corn by force, resulting in violent clashes during which a number of Indians were killed. In December 1607, Captain John Smith, who over time became a leader of the Jamestown colony, was leading an expedition further into Powhatan territory along the Chickahominy River when he ran into a band of Powhatan warriors led by Seneca's brother Opechancanough. 2 Englishmen were killed during the skirmish, and Opechancanough took Smith captive. He took his prisoner to several villages in a public demonstration that the English were not invincible. Smith was then taken to Werowocomoco to meet with Seneca. The Englishman told the Powhatan chief that his men had been defeated in battle by the Spanish and were seeking refuge. The news that the English and Powhatans shared a joint enemy led Seneca to offer an alliance to Smith. Seneca suggested that the Jamestown colony should join the Powhatan Confederacy with Smith as its werowance or chief. Moreover, the colonists were offered the more inhabitable village of Capahawasik, east of Werowocomoco, from where they could defend the Powhatan capital from attacks. In return, the Englishmen were to supply the Powhatans with swords and other metal items. Smith agreed to consider the offer and was inducted into the Confederacy in a 4-day religious ceremony. As part of the ceremony, he may also have been adopted as Seneca's son. According to an account from Smith, which was published in 1616 and further developed in his General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, which was in print from 1624, the Powhatans were preparing to kill him with clubs during the ceremony when the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, unexpectedly intervened and asked them to stop, before placing her arms around his head to save his life. This account is the basis for the most famous story in Pocahontas's life, one that had been romanticized in the 1995 Disney movie Pocahontas, which claims that Pocahontas had saved Smith's life because she was in love with him. However, there is no mention of the incident in the account Smith wrote in 1608, A True Relation of Virginia. The anthropologist Frederick Gleach suggests that mock execution was part of a ritual to demonstrate the Powhatan's power over Smith. The historian Camilla Townsend discredits the tale on the basis that Smith had a tendency to claim repeatedly that a local woman fell in love with him in his later accounts of his extensive travels around the world. Costello, citing oral tradition, claims that Powhatan children would not have been present during religious ceremonies, so there was no chance of Pocahontas saving Smith's life. According to Smith's True Relation, it was not from the Powhatans that he needed saving. After his return to Jamestown in January 1608, Smith was welcomed by most of the colony, but a few of his fellow captains blamed him for the deaths of 2 colonists at the hands of the Indians and arrested him. Fortuitously, Captain Christopher Newport arrived on a resupply mission from England that night and ordered Smith to be released. As far as Seneca and Pocahontas were concerned, the Englishmen were now part of the Powhatan Confederacy, and Smith was a subordinate chief. While Costello claims that this was a sign of Seneca's good intentions, the Powhatan chief would also have been motivated by the desire to demonstrate that he was in charge and that the English were under his control. The agreement with Smith ushered in a period of peace and goodwill, and Smith returned to Jamestown, accompanied by 4 guides laden with gifts and supplies. Seneca continued to send food to Jamestown, and as a sign of his trust in Smith, he allowed his daughter, Pocahontas, to join the entourages of priests and warriors paddling around the Virginia Peninsula in their dugout canoes to bring supplies to the English fort. The English believed that Pocahontas had decided to bring them food on her own initiative, but as a 10 or 11-year-old child, it is unlikely that she had the autonomy to make the 12-mile journey from Weromocomoco to Jamestown on her own account, and was rather acting on the orders of her father and his priests. The English were fond of Pocahontas, and English accounts from the 17th century mention her showing young English boys how to do cartwheels within the walls of the fort. Pocahontas nevertheless played an important diplomatic role in demonstrating to the English that the Powhatans had peaceful intentions. According to Powhatan custom, a female child would often accompany such missions, since an all-male party of warriors and priests might, understandably, be viewed as an aggressive gesture. As a confident young girl and the Powhatan chief's favorite daughter, Pocahontas was an ideal candidate for the role. During these visits, Pocahontas met Smith on many occasions. The girl attempted to learn English at Jamestown, while Smith may have asked her to help him with his understanding of the Powhatan language by pointing to various objects or asking her for the Powhatan translation of various words. While Pocahontas answered Smith's questions about Powhatan society and customs, the young girl would also have brought back information about life in Jamestown to her father in Werowocomoco. During the late summer of 1608, relations between the English and the Powhatan deteriorated as a result of droughts which affected the harvest and led to a shortage of food for both the native population and the English colonists. The English had been slow to plant crops to feed themselves, and while Captain Newport was shuttling back and forth across the Atlantic to obtain new supplies for the colony, the English recognized that they would not survive without assistance from the Powhatan. Accordingly, Newport invited Waughun-Seneca to be crowned in a ceremony recognizing him as a king. During the ceremony, Waughun-Seneca refused to kneel and asserted that he was already a king, and eventually he agreed to incline his head forward to receive the crown. As paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, he had no intention of subordinating himself to anyone. Indeed, he was under the impression that Smith had submitted to him on behalf of the Englishmen in Jamestown. Not long after the ceremony, Smith, now head of the colony, traveled extensively across the Chesapeake Bay, seeking food from Powhatan villages in exchange for beads and trinkets. When the locals demanded more valuable goods, Smith threatened to shoot the chief in order to force the people to give up all their food before throwing down some beads in return. Sometime in December 1608 or January 1609, Smith went to Werowocomoco unannounced while Waughun-Seneca was away. After being informed of Smith's arrival, the Powhatan chief hurried back to his capital and berated the Englishman for his behavior. He told him that he desired peaceful relations and that the English could have what they wanted without resorting to violence and intimidation. According to Smith's 1624 account, Pocahontas visited him late at night and informed him that her father was planning to kill him and his men. However, the Englishmen were left alone and allowed to leave the following morning. Smith's account again seems dubious here. It seems improbable that Pocahontas could be allowed out unsupervised at night on her own at the age of 12, especially if Powhatan warriors were guarding Smith's residence to prevent him from escaping. In any case, the English were already suspicious about Powhatan intentions and would have been on guard. Following Smith's meeting with Powhatan, it appears that some deal was arranged whereby the Powhatans would supply Jamestown with food in exchange for swords and firearms. As part of the deal, the Jamestown settlers, which included a party of German and Polish craftsmen, agreed to build a house in the English style for Waughun-Seneca in Werowocomoco. Either side appeared keen to abide by the deal. Rather than returning to Jamestown, Smith's band traveled deeper into Powhatan territory up the Pamunkey River, where he claimed to have been attacked by Opechancanoug's men, but was able to resist their attempts to capture him. By the time Smith returned to Werowocomoco, the village had been abandoned and the English house was left unfinished. In order to distance himself from the English, Waughun-Seneca moved his base further inland, possibly to the village of Orapax on the Chickahominy River, and Pocahontas was no longer allowed to accompany any diplomatic missions to Jamestown henceforth. By the summer of 1609, the local Paspahegh tribe was raiding Jamestown, while Smith sought to build more forts further inland up the James River to consolidate English control of the territory. By late 1609, neither Johann Seneca nor Pocahontas had seen John Smith since January. In October, Smith had been badly injured by a gunpowder accident in his canoe and left for England to seek treatment, never to return to Virginia. The English informed Pocahontas that Smith had died. In reality, the English colonists may have felt uneasy about Smith's close relationship with the Powhatan chief and wanted him out of the way, and the accident was a convenient excuse to send him back home. In November, the new president of the colony, George Percy, sent a boat to the new Powhatan capital to ask Johann Seneca for food. When the Powhatan chief refused, stating that he would no longer give away food without receiving anything in return, some of the Englishmen tried to seize corn by violent means. Johann Seneca responded by capturing and killing the party's leader, Captain John Ratcliffe, and a number of other colonists. Whether the result of cultural misunderstandings or belligerence from both sides, the English and Powhatans were now effectively at war, and Johann Seneca was by now desperate for the English to go away and leave him and his people in peace. Although not entirely defenseless, the Powhatans struggled to prevent the English from taking control of the entire length of the James River, destroying Powhatan villages in the process, killing and enslaving many of the Indians. With the English and the Powhatans now at war and Pocahontas kept safely away from the English, there are far fewer references to Pocahontas in English sources for several years, especially given Smith's departure from Virginia. The situation in Jamestown was getting desperate during the winter of 1609 and 1610, known in sources as the Starving Time. Although the ship Sea Venture had left England on a major supply mission in May 1609, the vessel was wrecked in Bermuda in July. The 150 or so survivors remained in Bermuda for almost a year to construct new ships to allow them to continue their journey to Jamestown. On the 23rd of May 1610, the surviving party of some 140 people in 2 ships arrived in Jamestown, where they found 60 survivors in the fort and 40 more men in other outposts. Deputy Governor Thomas Gates, in temporary charge until the arrival of the colony's new governor, Thomas West, 3rd Baron Delaware, soon decided that they could not survive in Jamestown for much longer and embarked on their ships to sail back to England. Just as they were setting off on the 10th of June, another relief fleet arrived carrying Lord Delaware, who later gave his name to the river and state of Delaware. The colonists duly returned to Jamestown. Pocahontas and other Powhatan Indians had come very close to being rid of the English colonists, but they were not to be so lucky. Around this time, when she reached puberty aged 12 or 13, Pocahontas had her coming-of-age ceremony, signifying that she was ready to be married. According to Powhatan custom, as part of the ceremony, the individual was required to choose a new name to go with their new identity. It is quite possible that this is when Matoaka formally adopted the name Pocahontas, by which she had already been known informally. Johann Seneca had supposedly heard that the English colonists planned to kidnap Pocahontas and kept her coming-of-age ceremony low-key. As part of the celebrations, the Powhatans held a courtship dance. Pocahontas danced with a man named Kocoum, one of Johann Seneca's 50 or so elite warriors, and the pair soon married. Kocoum's older brother, Jepazor, was chief of the Patawomeck tribe, which gave its name to the Potomac River, and a close friend of Johann Seneca. The couple appear to have moved to the Patawomac village of Passapatancy, though other sources claim they remained at Wahunseneka's capital. William Strachey, writing in 1612, refers to Pocahontas being married to a private captain called Kokuam some 2 years since. While living at Passapatancy, Pocahontas gave birth to a son, also named Kokuam, though others suggest that they had a daughter named Kaoki. Yet other historians have questioned whether Pocahontas could realistically have given birth to a child at this time, given her young age. While these developments were occurring in Pocahontas's own world, the English continued their efforts to expand from Jamestown, and by early 1611 they had effectively eliminated the Paspahegh tribe and killed its chief. As Virginia Company officials in London wondered how to bring the other Indian tribes under English control, the idea of abducting a child of royal blood was proposed on more than one occasion. One of Delaware's captains, Samuel Argall, sailed up the Potomac River looking for corn and established contact with the Patawomac. Argall did not come across Pocahontas, but came across a young English boy, Henry Spelman, who had been taken captive by the Indians and was then living with the Patawomac. Argall bought Spelman's freedom and returned to England with the boy. In the spring of 1611, Lord Delaware fell ill and returned to England, leaving Thomas Gates in charge once again. In late 1612, Argall returned to Virginia and set off once again to obtain food from the Patawomac. On a further trip in March 1613, he was informed that Pocahontas was then living at Passapatancy. Sensing the opportunity to seize the Powhatan chief's favourite daughter and ransom her for a favourable agreement with Wahunseneka, Argall confronted Chief Jepezor and demanded that he bring Pocahontas on board his ship and threatened to go to war if he did not comply. What happened next is a matter of dispute. According to Argall's recollections, Jepezor met with his council and after a long deliberation decided that it was in their best interests to give Pocahontas up. The Patawomac chiefs sent word to Wahunseneka, who did not wish to see further violence and decided to allow Pocahontas to board Argall's ship with an agreement that she would be released unharmed. Jepezor's wife was dispatched to bring Pocahontas aboard the ship, and Argall offered to give the women a tour. It is unclear how much Pocahontas had been told about the arrangement, but when she demanded to get off the boat, Argall allowed Jepezor's wife to leave but kept Pocahontas on board as a captive. He then issued a set of demands to be sent to Wahunseneka for the release of his daughter, including the liberation of all English prisoners in Powhatan captivity and the return of English weapons that the Powhatans possessed. Wahunseneka sent the messengers back informing Argall that he was prepared to submit to the English demands. As Argall prepared to sail, he gave Jepezor a copper pot, supposedly so that he could claim that the Patawomac had sold her into captivity. Rather than going to Wahunseneka to make the exchange, Argall took Pocahontas to Sir Thomas Gates in Jamestown. Furthermore, it seems that while carrying out the abduction, a group of Englishmen had gone to Pocahontas's home and killed her husband, Kokuam, though he may have been killed in an earlier battle. Wahunseneka sent the prisoners some weapons and a shipment of grain to Jamestown as demanded by Argall, but Governor Gates decided that it was not sufficient and kept Pocahontas in custody. Since Wahunseneka was unlikely to attack Jamestown while his daughter was a prisoner there, the English authorities decided it was in their interest to detain her indefinitely. The experience must have been traumatic for both Wahun Seneca and Pocahontas, who had just a few years earlier been cartwheeling around Jamestown with English boys. Rather than keep her in Jamestown, Gates decided to send her upriver to the new settlement at Henrico, founded by the English military commander Thomas Dale near present-day Richmond. The prisoner was taken to live with Reverend Alexander Whitaker, who was given the task of teaching her Christianity with his Bible. The son of a Cambridge theologian, Whitaker sailed to the New World in 1611, hoping to convert the natives, and helped Dale to found Henrico. In a religious pamphlet from 1612 entitled Good News from Virginia, Whitaker argued that the natives lived in spiritual darkness and that it was the duty of Englishmen to enlighten the locals and feed and clothe them both literally and spiritually. The Powhatans might have enjoyed the irony of the Englishmen who struggled to feed themselves, suggesting that they had come to Senecomaca to feed the locals. Some accounts suggest that Pocahontas fell into a deep depression after being informed by the English that her father was not willing to pay her ransom. In an effort to raise Pocahontas's spirits, the English asked Wahun Seneca to send her one of her sisters. The latter, perhaps hopeful that the English were showing consideration for his beloved daughter's well-being, decided to send her oldest sister, Matachana, and her husband, Otomatamachin. Pocahontas possibly confided to her sister at this juncture that she had been attacked, possibly multiple times by multiple men, and that this was the reason that Pocahontas had been sent to Henrico in the first place. There, it became evident that she was pregnant, and she was being dressed in English clothes to hide her growing belly. While the English sources would never have admitted this if it were true, some scholars cast doubt on this claim, as it would not have been in the Englishmen's interests to mistreat Pocahontas if they still planned to use her for diplomatic purposes. During Pocahontas's captivity in Henrico, Reverend Whitaker was sympathetic toward her plight and agreed with her that the English people had behaved improperly and had brought a lot of their troubles upon themselves. On Sundays, she would have joined the colonists at religious meetings. One of the English colonists at Henrico was the 28-year-old John Rolfe. Rolfe and his wife Sarah were on board the Sea Venture in 1609 when the ship grounded on the islands of Bermuda. Sarah gave birth to a daughter named Bermuda, who died on the island, and Sarah herself died soon after arriving in Jamestown, leaving John a childless widower. In Virginia, he began to cultivate the tobacco crop and introduced a special strain for export in 1612. In doing so, he played a huge role in the development of the colony, as the managers of the Virginia Company back in London now realized there was extensive profit to be made from tobacco cultivation here and doubled down on their investment. Rolfe may have also helped Whitaker teach Pocahontas English and encouraged her to convert to Christianity. Indeed, Rolfe had a particular incentive for Pocahontas to become a Christian, as he claims to have fallen in love with her in a letter to Thomas Dale. Perhaps he was genuinely in love. Perhaps he was lonely following the loss of his wife, or perhaps he recognized that his marriage to a native princess would elevate his standing among the Powhatans. While Pocahontas did not leave a written record of her thoughts, she said she loved Rolfe and later accepted baptism. Perhaps she did so because she felt alone and considered marriage to a white man superior to life as a prisoner or a slave. In March 1614, Thomas Gates left for England and Thomas Dale assumed the governorship of the colony. After assuming power, Dale planned to force a showdown with the Powhatans by taking Pocahontas with him and sailing upriver to confront Wahunseneka at his capital, demanding the remaining weapons and another shipment of food. The Powhatans informed the governor that their chief was away, but promised to send word. The English sailed further upriver, where Pocahontas was greeted by two of her brothers. After informing them that she planned to marry John Rolfe, her brothers offered to remain on board the British ship as hostages, while Rolfe and a young English interpreter set out to find Wahunseneka. The paramount chief, fearing for his own safety, was unwilling to take part in negotiations himself, so instead the Powhatan guides took the Englishmen to Opikankanu. The latter agreed to collect and return the remaining weapons and to send more food to Jamestown, while informing the Englishmen that Wahunseneka was prepared to allow Pocahontas to marry Rolfe. It is unlikely that Wahunseneka would have consented had his daughter not already been a prisoner, but he shared Pocahontas's belief that this was the least bad option to keep her from harm and maintain some semblance of peace. In April 1614, Pocahontas accepted baptism into the Christian faith in a ceremony conducted by Whitaker. She received the Christian name Rebecca, after the wife of Isaac in the Old Testament. While the English believed that Pocahontas accepted the Christian teaching in full, some historians suggest that in accordance with other Indians who agreed to convert, she was incorporating the Christian God and Jesus Christ into her existing polytheistic pantheon of Powhatan gods. In any case, Pocahontas's conversion subsequently enabled her marriage to John Rolfe on the 5th of April 1614. She would have been 17 or 18 years old at the time, while her husband was 29. While Wahunseneka was not present at Pocahontas's wedding because he was afraid he would be captured or killed and that the Powhatan Confederacy would collapse following his demise, he sent his younger brother and heir Opitchapam and two of his own sons to represent him. The marriage ushered in another period of peace between the English and Powhatans that would endure for 8 more years. Dale granted Rolfe a tract of land across the James River from the main settlement at Henrico, where the newlywed couple would live. Although Rolfe's tobacco crop showed some promise, it was still considered inferior to Spanish tobacco, which the English were forced to import back home in Europe. The Powhatans also grew tobacco, though the native Virginia crop was bitter and was largely used for ceremonial purposes. Thereafter, Rolfe established the Varina plantation and continued his experiments with the crop, most likely relying on advice from Pocahontas or the Powhatan priests to hang each leaf and dry them on a rack rather than pile them up and let them sit in the sun. In early 1615, Pocahontas gave birth to a son whom they named Thomas, most likely being named after the governor, Thomas Dale, who was a close friend and had allowed the marriage between Rolfe and Pocahontas to go ahead in the first place. In addition to granting Rolfe the land to build his new plantation, Dale had also appointed him secretary to the colony. The Rolfes were one of the leading households in the colony, and Pocahontas, or Rebecca Rolfe as she was known to the English community, would have supervised a team of native workers growing tobacco at the plantation. Soon after Pocahontas's wedding, the English colonist Ralph Hamer proposed to Johann Seneca that he should send another of his daughters to marry Thomas Dale, although Dale already had a wife in England. Johann Seneca refused in no uncertain terms and argued that he was not prepared to give up another of his daughters, further supporting the idea that he would not have consented to Pocahontas's marriage had she not been in captivity already. Despite this refusal, the English and the Powhatans remained at peace. The colony gradually began to turn around its economic fortunes, and Rolfe was optimistic about his tobacco crop after introducing his new methods. At some point in late 1615 or early 1616, Rolfe asked his wife whether she would be willing to go to London. In order to attract more capital, the Virginia Company was desperate to show its investors in England that the venture was bearing fruit, especially as several individuals who had promised money to the company failed to pay up after reading reports from Virginia of hunger, disease, and conflict. In addition to a cargo of Rolfe's tobacco, the company directors hoped to bring over the Indian princess who had converted to Christianity and married an Englishman. English elite society was extremely curious about Virginia at the time, and a few years earlier Shakespeare had written The Tempest, based on accounts of the wreck of the Sea Venture in Bermuda. The opportunity to see Pocahontas in the flesh on the streets of London would go a long way to satisfying that curiosity. In April 1616, Pocahontas joined her husband and son in boarding the English ship Treasurer, captained by Samuel Argall, the same man and the same ship which had taken her into captivity 3 years earlier. Governor Thomas Dale was also on board, as were around a dozen other Powhatan, including Pocahontas's brother-in-law, Utamatamakin, and possibly also Pocahontas's sister, Matachana. They all also travelled to England. Other Powhatan would have included several servants, as well as a number of priests in disguise to gather intelligence about England. If the English stood to gain by exhibiting Pocahontas in the Old World, then Johann Seneca also sought to obtain his own advantages from the visit. After sighting land at Cornwall, the ship called at Plymouth on the 12th of June 1616. According to John Smith's 1624 account, Utamatamakin had been asked by Johann Seneca to determine whether Smith was really dead and to tell him how many people lived in England. Smith claimed that after they met in London, Utamatamakin told him that after arriving in Plymouth, he began to count the number of people he saw by cutting notches into a stick, but soon gave up. Although Johann Seneca almost certainly asked his son-in-law to provide an estimate of England's population, the anecdote was probably invented by Smith to suggest the Powhatans were primitive people. Even so, Pocahontas, Utamatamakin, and the other Powhatan who accompanied them would have been overwhelmed by the number of people they encountered in England. They soon arrived in London, a bustling city of over 200,000 people at the time, a population centre of unimaginable scale compared to the hundreds or low thousands of people that made up each tribe in the Powhatan Confederacy. The Rolfes and their Indian delegation stayed at the Belle Savage Inn, a popular place to stay in the city, located on the north side of Ludgate Hill near St. Paul's Cathedral. Sir Edwin Sandys, a member of Parliament and investor in the Virginia Company, persuaded the company to pay the Lady Rebecca £4 a week to cover the cost of the stay in London. In the meantime, Rolfe's tobacco had been unloaded and tested, and its taste was deemed to be superior to that of Spanish tobacco, ensuring that the Virginia colony would have a viable commercial future. It still remained for the Virginia Company to demonstrate that it was safe to travel to Virginia, and the country was not full of bloodthirsty wild savages, or that at the very least they could be tamed and brought under control. At Sir Edwin's request, John Rolfe wrote a report asserting that Virginia was now at peace, and all the colony needed to ensure its success was more people to plant tobacco. As further proof that the Powhatans could be tamed, the company was eager to introduce Lady Rebecca to London society. In order to play her part, Pocahontas used part of the money she was given to buy clothes for her and her attendants to dress in the English style. Pocahontas and her entourage soon received invitations from curious Londoners to visit them. The Reverend Samuel Purchas, whose church was nearby, recalled meeting Otamatamakin and Pocahontas at the house of a man named Dr. Goldston, whom they visited frequently. The Powhatan priest and the English reverend argued about their respective religions, with the former refusing to accept that there was a single Christian God, while promoting the cause of his own gods. Purchas also noted that Rolfe informed him, presumably based on conversations with his wife, that much of what was known by the English about Powhatan religion was mistaken and based on misunderstandings in Reverend Whitaker's 1612 book. Purchas was more positive about Pocahontas and was impressed by her regal bearing. In late 1616, the young Dutch engraver Simon van der Pas made a sketch of Pocahontas for an engraving that could be widely distributed and has become a famous image of early English involvement in the Americas. The artist shows Pocahontas wearing an expensive outfit and fine lace ruff with pearl earrings and a fan of 3 ostrich feathers resembling the heraldic device of the Prince of Wales. She is depicted wearing a tall capitaine hat that was usually reserved for men. Perhaps in response to what Englishmen were saying and writing about scantily clad Powhatan women, Pocahontas only shows her face. The engraving included a Latin inscription which translates to Matoaka, alias Rebecca, daughter to the mighty Prince Powhatan, Emperor of Virginia. After some time, Pocahontas decided that life in London was too crowded and stifling for her and wanted to move away. She may have been ill as well. Rolfe took her to Brentford in Middlesex, far away from the bustle of the city. There, in the autumn of 1616, John Smith came to call on them for the first time, leaving behind a curious account of his meeting with Pocahontas after a great many years and having previously known her as a child. Smith expected that Pocahontas would be happy to see him, but she turned away from him and left without saying a word. Smith wrote that he thought Pocahontas had forgotten how to speak English, but after a couple of hours she returned and said to him, "You did promise Powhatan what was yours should be his, and he the like to you. You called him father, being in his land a stranger, and by the same reason so must I do you." After Smith told her that she was a king's daughter and he had no right to be addressed as her father, Pocahontas unleashed her fury. "You were not afraid to come into my father's country and cause fear in him and all his people, and fear you here that I should call you father. I tell you then I will, and you shall call me child, and so I will be for ever and ever your countryman. They did tell us always you were dead, and I knew no other, till I came to Plymouth. Yet Powhatan did command Otamatamakin to seek you and know the truth, because your countrymen will lie much." While this exchange has been interpreted as Pocahontas telling Smith that he had betrayed her love by leaving her behind, it is far more likely that she was accusing Smith of failing to abide by the political understanding he had made with her father, and that, after reneging on his promises, he had gone back to England without a word, while making the Powhatans believe that he was dead. At the same time, she was letting Smith know that neither she nor her father had gone back on their word to be friendly to the colonists. In his General History, John Smith wrote that upon hearing of Pocahontas's arrival in Plymouth, he wrote to Queen Anne, the wife and consort of King James I, with a positive account of Pocahontas's character and her assistance to the English at Jamestown, and urged the royal family to grant her an audience. This is where he first mentioned Pocahontas intervening to save his life, perhaps dramatizing events for his royal recipient. Others, such as Edwin Sandys, Lady Delaware and Lady Elizabeth Dale, may have also sponsored the meeting. Pocahontas had a formal audience with the king and queen and impressed them with her understanding of royal etiquette, while Smith claimed that Utamutamakin refused to believe that he had met King James because he was not given a gift. It is well documented that Pocahontas and Utamutamakin attended the Twelfth Night Masque in early January 1617 at the banqueting house in Whitehall Palace and sat near the king. They were treated to a performance of Ben Jonson's The Vision of Delight, featuring special effects designed by the greatest architect of England in those days, Inigo Jones. While English society treated Pocahontas respectfully in her presence, social commentator John Chamberlain wrote to the diplomat Sir Dudley Carleton after seeing the engraving of Pocahontas and remarked, "Here is no fair lady, and yet with her tricking up and high style and titles you might think her and her worshipful husband to be somebody." In addition to his disparaging remarks about Pocahontas's appearance, Chamberlain was irritated about the fact that John Rolfe, a fellow commoner, had been allowed the honour of sitting near the king at the royal masque. By March 1617, after around 9 months in England, the Rolfes were prepared to return to Virginia. Prior to their departure, Edwin Sandys informed the Rolfes that the Virginia Company had raised substantial new investment money on the back of Pocahontas's visit, and that the couple should have £100. Samuel Argall was once again to be the captain of the vessel and was due to take over governorship duties upon arrival in Virginia. By the time the ship reached Gravesend in Kent, Rolfe informed Argall. Some accounts claim that Pocahontas fell ill after having dinner with Rolfe and Argall and informed her sister Matachana that she had been poisoned before dying on the ship. It is possible that Pocahontas had been healthy prior to her death, and that the Englishmen plotted to poison her after her outburst to Smith indicated that she was aware that the English intended to take over her father's land. However, most scholars reject the poisoning theory and believe that Pocahontas and her son were suffering from an infectious disease, possibly pneumonia, having little or no immunity to European diseases. The party disembarked and went to an inn in Gravesend, where Pocahontas died at the age of 20 or 21. She was buried at St. George's Church in Gravesend on the 21st of March, 1617. The church was destroyed by fire in 1727 and was rebuilt, and her remains were lost. While Pocahontas died and several of her Powhatan companions were too sick to travel, her son Thomas survived. Argall was keen to set sail, and Rolfe chose to board the ship and leave his son behind in the care of his brother. After a month or so, they arrived in Jamestown to find the colony in poor condition. Rolfe informed the Indians of Pocahontas' death and reported that she was much lamented by her people, who hoped to see her son Thomas once he was capable of making the transatlantic journey. Wahun Seneca, who had already seemed to take a step back from political power several years earlier, appeared to relinquish power to his younger brother, Opichapam, while Opikankanu continued to serve as a diplomatic representative and military leader. Meanwhile, Argall wrote back to England claiming that Utamata delivered a report extremely critical of the English, and Thomas Dale in particular, but that Opikankanu dismissed the complaints and Utamata was disgraced. Camilla Townsend suggests that the scene was staged, and Opikankanu took the report seriously but waited until the appropriate time to take action. During the summer of 1617, an epidemic struck the Powhatans, possibly the same disease that killed Pocahontas. The Powhatans were unable to provide the tribute of food promised to the English, and during the subsequent negotiations in March 1618, Opikankanu informed the English that he refused to give away any of his land to anyone other than the young Thomas Rolfe. Later that year, Wahun Seneca died, perhaps heartbroken about his daughter's death the previous year. While Opichapam officially succeeded his late brother as paramount chief, Opikankanu continued to call the shots when it came to Anglo-Powhatan relations, which continued to deteriorate. Argall was recalled to England for mismanaging the colony, and Sir George Yeardley was appointed in his stead in November 1618. Yeardley presided over the first meeting of the democratically elected Virginia General Assembly in Jamestown in July 1619. Among the tasks of the Assembly was to parcel up tracts of land to the settlers, necessitating further encroachment on Powhatan territory and causing further tensions with Opikankanu. Although not a member of the Assembly, Rolfe remained an important figure in the colony and sought to present himself to the Virginia Company in London as an intermediary between the colonists and the Powhatan, though around this time he married a third time to Joan or Jane Pierce, the daughter of his friend Captain William Pierce. Jane gave birth to a daughter named Elizabeth in 1620. Rolfe fell seriously ill in late 1621 and died of illness in March 1622. News of Rolfe's death reached London alongside reports of a calamity that had struck the Jamestown colony. On the 22nd of March, Opikankanu led his warriors in a series of attacks against the English which killed between 350 and 400 colonists, while a couple of dozen women were captured as prisoners. This was one of the most devastating attacks on an English colony by the natives seen in the 17th century. Yet, while in the short term Opikankanu's raid was successful in giving the Powhatans some breathing space, in the long run it gave the English the justification they sought to eliminate the Powhatan. William Pierce was among the men who joined the English survivors in their campaign of retribution against the Powhatan. In around 1635, Pierce arranged for Thomas Rolfe, now 20 years old, to travel to Virginia. In 1641, despite ongoing hostilities, Rolfe sought and was granted permission to visit Opikankanu and his maternal aunt, whom he called Cleopatra. Since Pocahontas had many sisters, this must have been one of Pocahontas's sisters who accompanied her to England. Given Wahun Seneca's reluctance to part with his unmarried daughters, Cleopatra may have been Utamata wife, Matachana. In April 1644, Opikankanu, who would have been in his 80s or 90s at the time, led another major attack on the English colonists. Though another 400 or so English settlers were killed, it was not enough to stop the English from increasing their power. The colonists strengthened their defences, and in August 1646, the English captured Opikankanu and killed him in captivity in October. His successor, Nakotewonts, signed a treaty submitting to the English crown, and the Powhatan Confederacy soon disintegrated. Around the same time, Lieutenant Thomas Rolfe was assigned to the command of Fort James on the Chickahominy River. He married the daughter of a local landowner who gave birth to a daughter named Jane, who married into the Bowling family, one of the leading families of Virginia. Edith Bowling Wilson, the second wife of President Woodrow Wilson, was a direct descendant of Pocahontas. Matoaka, Rebecca, Pocahontas. These are the names that were given at various stages to a daughter of Chief Powhatan Wahansenaca in what is now Eastern Virginia. Pocahontas's life has been romanticized by English colonists and their American descendants as a Native American princess who seemingly fell in love with two Englishmen and willingly adopted English customs, only for her father and other Powhatan men to take up arms against English settlers. The descendants of her Powhatan kinsmen see her as one of the earliest victims of a genocidal policy by English colonists driven by money and power to control and exploit their homeland. While she may not have been raped or poisoned by the English, Pocahontas's life was certainly no Disney fairy tale. She was kidnapped by the English, who used her as a bargaining chip, and whatever her personal feelings towards John Rolfe may have been, she decided to marry him while she was a prisoner. After helping her husband run his plantation, she was taken to England and exhibited as an object of curiosity, though on occasion she and her brother-in-law, Otamata spoke up for their people, their culture, and their political independence. She died tragically in her early 20s due to her exposure to European diseases, but even had she lived and returned home to Virginia, it is doubtful that the Anglo-Powhatan peace could have endured for much longer. What do you think of Pocahontas? Did she willingly adopt English customs and marry John Rolfe out of love, or did she do so in an effort to maintain peaceful relations between her Powhatan nation and the English newcomers? Please, let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.